Thank you. I'm very glad to be here today, and I'm very glad to be in the company of such esteemed colleagues. This trip to Arkansas allows me to engage in two of my favorite activities, historical research and shopping, as I fully intend to partake of the Dillard's additional 40% off sale as soon as we're done here. And this topic is very interesting to me as well, World War I. My grandfather served in World War I, and I too am an Army veteran, so a lot of this has been intensely interesting to me. And so in discussing World War I, the Great War, African American achievements and struggles in Arkansas have often been overlooked. While black men served in the military fighting for democracy and the extension of democracy in foreign lands, African Americans also supported the war stateside through various means. But they were constantly struggling to obtain the reality of the democratic promise for themselves in the United States. And so this is my first image. African Americans, of course, served in the military during World War I. We've heard a lot about that today already from Dr. Fisher. But what this is an example of a registration card for Harvey Cincinnatus Ray. And Ray was actually the first African-American agricultural extension service agent hired in Arkansas, I believe, back in 1915. And just a little additional tidbit of information, you may be familiar, well, I'm sure you are familiar with the Little Rock Nine, and you may in fact be participating in some of the activities that have been going on in the last few days. Well, Gloria Ray Callmark, and that's her married name, is Harvey Ray's daughter by his second wife, Julia. And his first wife, Mary L. Ray, was Arkansas's first African-American home demonstration agent. She was hired to work in Arkansas in 1918. So I'm not going to belabor that point too much, but this is his registration card, and you can see here, natural born, District Agricultural Agent, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and he was married to his first wife at the time until she died in 1934. This is another image of African American soldiers from the Encyclopedia of Arkansas History and Culture, and this is most likely in Brinkley in Monroe County. Now, being an African American soldier in the Jim Crow South was a precarious situation to find oneself in. On the one hand, many African Americans served very patriotically, yet they are feared, and at the very same time, many people questioned whether or not African Americans could and would serve bravely and valiantly during the war. But as we do know, they do in fact do that. And here's another example of what I mean. This is just from Little Rock alone. Of the 5,200 men who registered in Little Rock in June 1917, 1,691 of them were African American. So African American men, again, as we do know, serve. A lot of this effort is helped out by African American institutions. So on this slide, Branch Normal College, which of course today is known as the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, although my mother-in-law reminds me that it was first Arkansas AM&N. It's a very important distinction. But Branch Normal College signed a government contract to train 2,400 soldiers for mechanical trades for the Army. And in fact, they built barracks at the institution. You can read all of that there, which had 4 Army officers in addition to its 14-member faculty. Now, of course, the military is segregated, and black soldiers were not permitted to access the resources available to white soldiers. And so what you have here is an example in 1918 when African American soldiers sought recreational activities, they could go to the Negro YMCA. And so as you see here, these are black soldiers from the 1st Battalion who were treated to an evening of music and games. And note that the fun began with the singing of My Country, 'Tis of Thee, which I find very interesting because as I was putting this together, I did wonder how these soldiers must have felt singing such a patriotic song in a segregated setting. At a time when African Americans had to be, or Americans generally, had to be convinced to support an international war, African Americans had particular reasons for doubt, considering their daily struggles with racial discrimination, segregation, and political and economic marginalization. Well, this talk on this next slide is from a Negro sailor by the name of Elroy W. Willis, who gave a talk to soldiers who were on their way to Camp Pike, where he gave a talk to soldiers in France at the Taborian Temple before they went to Camp Pike. And I believe, I might be wrong about this, the Taborian Temple might be the very same one that was chronicled in the recent film Dreamland, Little Rock's West 9th Street. African American soldiers' positions in the military often differed very little from the duties they performed in civilian life. So here's an example from July 1918, where black soldiers who were part of a camp sanitary squad were used as mosquito bait to combat mosquitoes at Camp Pike. So as it says here in the article, which as you see is from the Arkansas Democrat, no one ever noticed a Negro soldier standing on the street corners of Camp Pike with shirt sleeves rolled up above the elbow and a glass bottle in his hand. So black soldiers would stand at a designated spot every Friday for about 15 minutes until a mosquito landed on his arm. And then he would cover it with a glass tube, which contained a wad of cotton saturated with chloroform, and the specimen would then return to headquarters. So the squad, as you can see here, or perhaps you can't see because I didn't put the whole article on there, the squad covered 68 stations in and near the camp, while white non-commissioned officers rode on horseback and, quote, checked up on the men to see that none are missing or laying down on the job, end quote. Again, black soldiers often perform in the same sort of roles in the military that they would have been expected to perform in civilian life. So this is yet another example from November 1918, when black soldiers labored on a levee in Chico County when it sank. And so the commandant at Camp Pike, as it says here in this article, granted permission to extend the black soldiers' furlough by an additional 20 days. Now, when I was in the military and I heard furlough, that meant time off, not time at work. One of the other things that African Americans are fighting for is the extension of democracy here in the United States. So now let's turn our attention to politics. And so one of the things that's happening in Arkansas is that political struggles inform African Americans' understandings of what it means to, quote, make the war safe for democracy, end quote. And so before they became involved in the war, they had to deal with some problems within the Arkansas Republican Party, to which many had been loyal since the 19th century. And so as you can see here, in 1914 at the state convention, the Arkansas Republican Party voted to make the party lily white. That is, the lily white movement was the all-white and southern faction of the Republican Party. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, it attempted to eliminate African American influence. And as we can see here, according to this article, Lily White's bar, man and brother, and just a quote from the article, without advance notice and with scarcely a word of apology, the white majority in the Pulaski County Republican Central Committee at a meeting held yesterday at the Chamber of Commerce deprived of representation the Republican, this is what it says in the article, Negroes of the county. Negroes will no longer be given representation in the party organization of the county, nor will they even be allowed a voice in the selection of the party's candidates. All they may do in the future is blindly vote the ticket or seek suffrage expression with some other party. And so this is an example of another article from around the same time. And of course, the title says, Negroes are told to stay in the background. But African Americans do fight attempts to exclude them, even as some urge caution. And so after white Republicans vote 159 to 23 to exclude them, it was quoted that, quote, the announcement of the outcome of the vote caused much uproar among the Negroes, and several of them leaped to their feet. But the black Republican chairman, Johnny Bush, of course, one of the wealthiest African Americans in Arkansas, who was also the co-founder of the Mosaic Templars of America, quieted them and decided they would not take any action at that time. However, they immediately began to organize and call for a July 6th meeting. That's not right. But they immediately called for a meeting on July 6th at the Mosaic Templars, which of course was in the heart of the black community. And both groups showed up, or both groups held a convention at the same time, and both claimed to represent the state Republican Party. Just as another example, African Americans remained loyal to the Arkansas Republican Party throughout the World War I years and beyond. And in 1920, after the Lily White movement, when black Republicans, also known as the Black and Tans, met, they elected candidates for the National Convention in Chicago. And they further adopted a resolution denouncing the Congressional Republican Convention's endorsement of Lily Whiteism and branded its members a, quote, band of political marauders, end quote, and, quote, human leeches, end quote. Conversely, they also commented that white Republicans, they commended, rather, the white Republicans who refused to participate in the Lily White movement. So let's talk about black women during World War I. Like white women, black women embraced their patriotic duty during the war. And so in this April 1917 article in the Daily Arkansas Gazette, black women hold a patriotic meeting at a church in hope to, quote, arouse the Negro women in their duty to the county's crisis, and that, quote, women must cooperate with men in time of war economy in cooking and dressing and raising good gardens. And you can see here one member, also known as Aunt Dora, gave a speech pleading with black women for the, quote, absolute loyalty of her race to the country, and that she, quote, had 7 sons, and that she was ready to lead them all to the defense of her home and country. And then, as I said at the bottom, they had a flag raising and patriotic meeting at the local black school. And so, as Elizabeth Hill has already mentioned, black women also registered to work at civilian jobs at schools and colleges, and also at the headquarters for African American women at the Mosaic Temple. And this is just one example on the next slide here of some of the work in which black women engage. And that's just another example of black women registering under the Council of Defense. So they mentioned 1,000 white women registered, and some black women registered as well. So one of the things that black women end up doing is they are hired to assume men's jobs at the C.P. Wilson Stave Mill and the J.M. Peel and Brother Hoop Mill down in Lake Village, Arkansas, in Chico County. And as you can see here, they're required to wear overalls at a time when many women would not have worn pants. Now, black women are generally the lowest paid among all women, men and women. And so they're aware of this, and they don't accept this, they push back. And so this is an example of what I mean. This is a little difficult to see, but I'll tell you what it says. But that doesn't mean that they just accept their gender and racial discrimination. They fight back. So in this example from September 1918, black women laundresses in Little Rock fight back and claim that their employers had failed to recognize their union, the Laundry Workers Union, and to pay the $12 per week minimum wage, and that they couldn't subsist on anything less than that. They also wanted laundry conditions inspected regularly by agents of the Laundry Workers Union. And these complaints are investigated by representatives from the National War Labor Board, and black laundry workers testify that conditions of the laundry were abysmal, that it was hot, that they had to stand on concrete floors for very long hours during the day. And overall, 450 workers are impacted by this situation, 350 of whom were women, 65% of which were black women. Also in this article, managers of the Little Rock Laundry, the Imperial Laundry, and Frank's Steam Laundry argue that $10 per week was sufficient for wages, and that they objected to closed shops and preferred to deal with workers individually. And that before the union was organized, as they imagined it, they had had no trouble. We also know that black women sew for the Red Cross. Like I said, I'm not going to belabor this point because Ms. Hill has already talked about it in her fine book, her beautiful book, Faithful to Our Task, Arkansas's Women in the Great War. But like everything else in Southern and indeed in American society, in many ways at this time, it's segregated. But this is an example from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where they're setting up a sewing room for Negro units of the Red Cross. And here's another example on the next slide of African American women. And you can see here, you know, of someone who teaches at Branch Normal College. So middle class African American women who are setting this up at the Grand Masonic Temple down in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. We also know that African American women serve as nurses during World War I, so I'm going to show you an image we've already seen today. This is Maud Green, and I say the same thing. Comes from Carla Coleman, who's on the Black History Commission of Arkansas, and I also serve on that commission as well. Like everyone else in the nation, African Americans purchase war bonds and stamps to support the war effort. And African American women certainly do their share. So what you have here are the women of the HH of Ruth number 171 Order of Eastern Star and Osceola, Arkansas, who take out a $50 Liberty Bond from Citizens Bank. And the patriotic messages to support the war, of course, emanated from the pulpits of black churches. So here's an example of African American ministers who meet to discuss this. And as you can see here, they say, we must stand by our country in the purchase of war savings stamps. They're further concerned about black servicemen and discuss plans to have a camp pastor and additional social workers serving African Americans at Camp Pike. But while African American women support the war effort, it was in addition to extant local issues. And so on the next slide here, the Arkansas Association of Colored Women, I'll just call them the AACW, a network of black women's clubs, was established back in 1905. And one of the things they remain concerned about throughout World War I is creating industrial homes for black girls and boys. This is a consistent issue for them. So what they're doing during the war years is they're intensifying their efforts. So in 1917, using their limited political power, they asked Governor Charles Bruff to recommend to the state legislature that funds be appropriated to establish an industrial school for Negro boys. The AACW had already purchased 60 acres of land in Jefferson County, but they needed an appropriation from the state legislature to build the facility. And they continued to press for this issue during World War I and continued to do so until they got an industrial school, at least for black boys, in 1923. There is not one available for black girls until about 1949. This is just another example of the same, again, talking about the land that they had purchased in Pine Bluff. One of the other things that black women do is that they use their organizations to confront racism and racial stereotyping. And so one of the things they do in 1917 is that they protest the showing of Birth of a Nation in Little Rock, the silent film, of course, by W.D. Griffith. And this was shown at the Kempner Theater right here in this city. They organize, they present a petition to Mayor Charles E. Taylor and the Board of Censors, and unfortunately, their efforts are to no avail, particularly when the President Wilson, endorses the movie when he said, quote, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my regret is that it is all so terribly true," end quote. And he hosted a viewing of Birth of a Nation at the White House in 1915. And there's a copy of the article there, and I just happened to be scanning the newspaper and I saw this and I thought, this is significant, right? So this is one evidence of civil rights activism during World War I. Now when the war ends, African Americans are welcomed back to their home communities in some instances. So this is an example here of African American soldiers gathering at the Mosaic Temple to discuss things like whether or not they should establish a chapter of the American Legion, which of course would be segregated. I don't know if they managed to do so or not. Here's another example of how they are welcomed home by their communities. So this is from August 4, 1919 in the Hot Springs New Era. And black soldiers marched to Whittington Park in Hot Springs, where they were met by their families and greeted by the mayor, J.W. McClendon, and local black leaders. This is another example of African American soldiers returning to Conway, Arkansas, and being honored at their fairgrounds. But despite their brave and heroic service, African American soldiers returned to deeply entrenched Southern racism. And so here's an example of what I mean. In August 1919, Democratic Representative Thaddeus Caraway introduces a bill to prohibit African Americans from enlisting in the Army and the Navy to, quote, prevent, quote, race trouble. Here's another example of the bill that he introduces, again, to prevent race trouble. The bill would have provided for the discharge of African Americans currently in the military within 60 days and would have prohibited them from receiving appointments to the naval and military academies. At the same time, Caraway also proposed a bill to prohibit racial marriage in the District of Columbia. Black soldiers also had to endure increased racial violence during and after the war years, particularly as black soldiers returned home, seemingly unwilling to submit to the racial status quo they had left despite their military service. And so this is just one example in September 1919, for instance, from the Pine Bluff Daily Graphic, when Clinton Briggs, a recently discharged soldier who had served in France, was lynched in Star City, Arkansas, in Lincoln County after he allegedly, quote, made indecent proposals to Miss Ollie Bailey, end quote, the 18-year-old daughter of J.M. Bailey, a prominent Lincoln County planter. And I know everybody can't see this, but Briggs was held captive by about 30 men and was shot while being taken to a tree to be hanged. The coroner determined that his death resulted from, quote, gunshot wounds inflicted by persons unknown, end quote, which is what you would see in a lot of ads, newspaper articles about black lynchings all over the South at that point. And of course, we're all familiar with the 1919 Alene race massacre, which occurred after black farmers in Phillips County challenged economic and racial oppression by organizing the Progressive Farmers Household Union of America, or the PFHUA, when they met at a church in September 1919 to discuss suing their landlords for their fair share of the cotton crop. And as Dr. Fisher has already said, many of these men who were members of the union were World War I veterans. But I would also like to add that not all members of the union were men. Black women were members of the union as well. And one of the things that is missing that I've recently written about is how the Alene race massacre impacted African American women. This event has typically been portrayed as one that only involved black men and black women, black men and white men, and that is inaccurate. So black men serve in the American military, both stateside and overseas. Black women, of course, worked for the Red Cross in a number of capacities, including as nurses, registered to perform important wartime work, and utilized their organizational affiliations to press for much needed social, political, and economic reform. They expected their patriotism to be rewarded at the war's end. Unfortunately, the reality of being black in America, and particularly in the South and Arkansas, did not change during or after World War I. Indeed, the racial violence that occurred in this state and nationwide reinforced commitments to maintaining racial hierarchies. But despite this, black Arkansans overwhelmingly supported World War I, also known as the Great War. As they did so, however, they challenged America to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, both domestically and internationally. They pressed the nation to uphold its democratic promise by continually fighting, protesting, and organizing. Thank you. I'll entertain questions. Not everybody all at once. Yes, sir.
Following the participation of African Americans in the war, in light of what you were talking about, the returns that they made to much more racially hard areas, how many, or have you come across any research, any evidence to show how many of these veterans left the state as part of the Great Migration?
Yeah, I don't know exact numbers. What I can tell you is, and this is an article that's Dr. Story McKinron from the University of Central Arkansas wrote. She said between the late 19th century and through World War I, 200,000 black people came to Arkansas, right? And that of course should tell us that, you know, we have to be very careful when we talk about Southern this or that, because not all Southern states are the same. Right? So I don't know how many people left. I know quite a few African Americans leave in the late 19th century due to the Great Migration, and it's also part of the Back to Africa movement. A lot of people from the Arkansas Delta leave, but you're also having black people coming from other parts of the South to this state. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Professor, can you tell us a little bit about your work with women at Alene? You mentioned that. It's fascinating.
Yes, what I did was basically look at what is a very familiar story to anyone who knows anything about the Alene Race Massacre, and I queried how this impacted women. So there are a couple of books, of course, most notably Griff Stockley's book. There's another book called On the Lapse of Gods, and women's voices sort of come up, but nobody really pushes the analysis about the ways in which they understood the Alene Race Massacre. Nobody really even talks about the fact that they're members of the union. I mean, I have a membership card for one of these women. And no one also talks about what it means to be black and female in the rural South. So for example, when people talk about soldiers coming to Phillips County after this debacle at this church, nobody talks about the fact that, you know, these soldiers shot overwhelmingly women and children, and sexually assaulted and raped black women. That's not in anybody's story. So for me, it was very important to look at this experience through that particular gendered lens, because no one has written about it, and all the things that people have been talking about concerning the Alene Race Massacre and will continue to talk about as 1919 approaches, no one has discussed that.
Can you tell me a little about your sources? What are you using to...
I'm looking at...
I mean, is this something they just omitted in the newspapers, or you know, how is that?
You have to read sources against the grain, right, as you well know. But one of the things I looked at was Ida B. Wells' pamphlet on the Alene race riot. I mean, she came to Arkansas and interviewed these people, right? So she's talking to these men, but she's also spending a lot of time with the women and recording what their experiences were. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at other sources. I forgot the guy's name, but he was an African-American reverend, and he lambasted the military for sexually assaulting black women after also killing black women and children down in Alene, Arkansas. So the sources are there, as you well know. It just depends on what you're looking for when you look at the sources. And I'm looking very deliberately and intentionally for black women's voices. Well, thank you.